It's late, the streetlights are doing that thing, and we're going for a walk. Don't worry, I do this all the time. You've heard of a hot girl walk, but this is a haunt girl walk. I'm your favorite final girl, your friendly e-witch, the wicked witch of the web, and this is the show where we overthink horror on purpose. The movies, the monsters, and what they're really about underneath all the screaming. Think less scary podcast, more a walk with a friend who finds this stuff comforting. We walk, we talk, and we make it to dawn together. Cardio for the soul. Final girl fitness, a survival skill for the body. Because the girls who keep moving are the ones who make it to the credits. So put your headphones in, match my pace, and stay close, because tonight or today, we're getting into it. Is the final girl actually feminist, or just a purity myth? From Laurie Strode to now. Stay sharp, stay alive, and let's get on this haunt girl walk. So, I want to talk about the final girl today, the girl who makes it to the end credits, the babysitter who survives, the one still standing when the music stops and the killer's, presumably, finally down. We all love her. She's basically the patron saint of this whole channel, as you will come to find out. But I've been turning a question over in my head, and it's a thornier one than it looks. Is the final girl actually a feminist icon, or is she a purity myth wearing a feminist costume? Because the answer changes depending on which decade you're standing in, and honestly, depending on how closely you read her. So come walk with me and let's get into it. Let's start with where the term even comes from, because almost everyone gets this part wrong. Final girl isn't a fan term that bubbled up out of Tumblr. It comes with a film scholar named Carol Clover, who wrote a book in 1992 called Men, Woman, and Chainsaws. It's a very interesting book. She's the one who named the pattern. And here's the twist that nobody really remembers. Clover did not coin the term to celebrate a feminist heroine, not even close actually. Her argument was way stranger and way more uncomfortable than that. So basically, Clover noticed that the survivor in these slasher films was always a specific kind of girl. She's watchful, she's smart, a little bookish, a little uptight. She's not the one sneaking off to have sex. She often has a unisex name like Lori, Sydney, Stretch, Will, Teddy, Max. She's somehow both the most feminine figure in the film and the most masculine. And Clover's theory was that the final girl exists so that a teenage boy in the audience can have it both ways. He gets to feel terror through her, to be the helpless victim being chased through the dark. And then when she picks up the knife, the chainsaw, the weapon, whatever it is, and turns to fight back, he gets to feel mastery through her too. And Clover literally argued the final girl gets masculinized at the climax. So the moment she grabs the phallic weapon and stops running and starts hunting. She stops being read as a girl and starts being a stand-in for the boy watching. And just sit with that for a second. So the woman who invented the term final girl was arguing that the final girl is a vehicle for male identification. A boy's fantasy of survival in a girl's body, essentially. And that is not the empowerment poster we all hung up on the wall of what the final girl is. So already, before we even get into the purity question, the feminist reading is kind of on shaky ground, at least at its origin. Now let's talk about the purity myth, because this is the part everybody does remember. We see it all the time, you know the rules. Scream even spelled them out for us in 1996. You know, Randy standing in the living room, laying down the law, the rules. You can't have sex, you can't drink or do drugs, and you can never ever say, "I'll be right back." Basically break the rules and you die. And the unspoken first rule underneath all of it, the virgin survives. The good girl lives. The girls who have sex, who party, who want things, they get a blade through the chest. They die pretty early on. And their pleasure is the thing that gets them killed, essentially. And when you line up the bodies in the classic 80s slasher, the pattern is right there. The couple sneaks upstairs, the camera kind of lingers, and the second they have sex or the act is over, so are they. And meanwhile, our girl, who ends up being the final girl, is often downstairs, fully clothed, being responsible. She's a little weary, and she's the one who walks out at dawn every time. So you can absolutely read this as a deeply conservative little fairy tale. And these films exploded in the late 70s and through the Reagan 80s, a moment of real cultural backlash against the sexual freedom of the decade before. And here comes a genre that, movie after movie, teaches a very tidy lesson. Female desire is punishable by death, and chastity is the thing that saves you. That's the purity myth. Survival is a reward for being good, for being closed off, for not wanting anything, not wanting for yourself. So which is it? Feminist triumph or sexual morality play with a body count? Here's where I have to complicate both readings because the honest answer is messier and more interesting than either of those options. So first, the sex equals death rule is more legend than law. People have actually gone back and studied this, counted the bodies, run the numbers, and the link between having sex and dying is way weaker than the myth insists. And what the research tends to find is a little subtler and grimmer. It's not that the sexual characters die more often, it's that when the women die, the camera spends more time on it. Yeah, the death scenes are longer, they linger more, they're more eroticized. So the problem was never really a chastity rule book. The problem was the gaze, how the camera looked at women's bodies in pleasure and in death, and how often it blurred the line between the two. That's a Laura Mulvey idea, the male gaze, the camera built to look at women as objects for a male viewer. The purity myth is almost a distraction from the deeper thing, which is who the camera was built to serve, essentially. And second, even John Carpenter, who we know made Halloween, the movie that basically minted Laurie Strode as the template, has pushed back on the moral reading for decades. He's said the whole sex kids die because sex is bad interpretation was something critics layered on top, not a sermon that he was preaching. His take on why Laurie survives is funnier and more human than that. He said she survives partly because she's repressed. She's the uptight one. She's not really the one chasing boys, so all that energy gets channeled somewhere else, into being alert, into being competent, into noticing the thing is wrong before anyone else does. And in that reading, she's not surviving as a reward for purity, she's surviving because she's paying attention. And paying attention is a skill, not a virtue. And now third, let's actually look at the original Final Girls, because the empowerment icon reading falls apart there too, just from the other direction. So go back to the very first one Clover points at, which is actually Sally in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974. Does Sally win? I mean, technically she lives, but the last image of her is in the back of a pickup truck covered in blood, laughing and screaming at the same time. She's like completely shattered, broken, like lost it. And that's not victory, that's trauma. She didn't defeat anything, she just wasn't caught. And even Laurie in the original Halloween doesn't really beat Michael either. She survives him. She fends him off, she stabs him, and then the adult man with the gun shows up to actually end it. And even then, he doesn't either. So the original final girl isn't a conqueror, she's an endurer. Survival in the beginning was barely distinguishable from breaking. So here's where I've landed on the early years, the Laurie Strode era. The final girl was never cleanly feminist or cleanly a purity myth. She was a contradiction held in attention. She was a male-identified fantasy and a rare image of a woman who lasts. She was coded as pure, but the purity was less a moral reward and more of like an armor, and also, let's be honest, a way to keep her sexually unavailable to the camera so she could be the good one to root for. She's both the genre's most progressive figure and the carrier of its most conservative anxieties. In the same body at the same time. That's not a bug, that's what makes her interesting. And it's worth naming the other pole here as well, because the final girl isn't the only way horror imagines woman. There's a whole other tradition, what the scholar Barbara Creed called the monstrous woman. So the woman as the source of the horror, the witch, the possessed girl, the vengeful mother, the thing she bleeds, she births, she devours. And if the final girl is the woman the genre lets you save, the monstrous feminine is the woman the genre is terrified of. And the really juicy modern stuff happens when those two figures start to collapse into each other. Basically, when the final girl and the monster turn out to be the same woman. Hold that thought for a sec. Because here's the thing, even if the final girl was born compromised, she didn't stay there. The last 40 years have basically been one long argument with her origins, and the people doing the arguing have increasingly been women. You can watch her wake up in real time. We have Nancy in A Nightmare on Elm Street, 1984. She stops just running and starts setting traps, studying her enemy, taking the fight to him on purpose. We also have Ripley in Alien, which I know is sci-fi, but same DNA, a competent, unglamorous, kind of fully realized survivor who isn't surviving because she's pure. She's surviving because she's the best one in the room. And then 1996 Scream, and the genre turns around and looks straight at itself here. Sidney Prescott, she knows the rules. Like I said, the movie tells you the rules. And then Sidney has sex and lives anyways. So that's not an accident. That's the film deliberately taking the purity role out back and shooting it. Sidney's survival is decoupled from her chastity, and once you break that link, you can't really put it back. And from there, it accelerates. The Cabin in the Woods, love that movie so much. Cabin in the Woods, 2012, lots to talk about with that movie, but this takes the whole apparatus and makes it literal. Because in that film, if you've seen it, there's an underground organization that requires a set of victim archetypes to die in a specific order, and they need the virgin to be the last one standing because the ritual demands it. The movie is basically saying the quiet part out loud. The purity rule was never natural, it was always machinery. A system imposing a rule on a girl who never asked for it. We also have You're Next, 2011, gives us Erin, who was raised on a survivalist compound that turns out to be casually, terrifyingly good at staying alive. And the final girl as competent badass, no purity required. We also have Jennifer's Body, 2009, which was at the time dismissed and a little mishandled when it came out, but now reclaimed as a feminist text, totally iconic, takes the monstrous feminine and the final girl and tangles them up in a story that's really about female friendship, male exploitation. A lot more to say there that I'll probably get into in another video. We have Revenge, 2017. Takes the ugliest old subgenre, the rape revenge film, and re-aims the camera so the rage is hers, not a spectacle for someone else. And then the most recent turn, one that I find quite moving, the modern Final Girls is increasingly a study in trauma. So if we look at 2018, the Halloween, where Laurie Strode comes back not as a pure teenager, but now she's a grandmother who spent 40 years unable to put the knife down. She's barricaded, armed. She's been estranged from her own family because the survival broke something in her that was never able to heal. She's totally traumatized. The movie isn't about whether she's good, it's about what surviving costs. She's been spending all this time surviving and preparing to be attacked again, you know? We also have Midsommar. I know there's a lot of mixed reviews on Midsommar. I personally really loved Midsommar. I think daytime horror is sick. I think it can be scarier than nighttime horror. I'm actually going to get into that in the second episode. Loved Midsommar. Anyways, this is where the whole horror is really a breakup and a grief spiral, and the final girl arc is a woman finally being held. Horrifically, like by a cult, but still held. After everyone else in her life failed to do that for her, failed to make her safe. So we've gone from survival as a reward for purity to survival as a wound that you carry. And that's a completely different story. That's a story about being a person, not a parable about being a good girl. But I'd be doing this dishonestly if I didn't name the biggest blind spot in the whole tradition. The final girl has been overwhelmingly white. For decades, the girl the genre decided was worth saving, the one coded as innocent and vulnerable and pure, she was almost always a white girl. And that's not separate from the purity myth, it's built into it because purity and innocence worth protecting has never been neutral ideas here. There's a long, ugly history of whose womanhood gets treated as sacred and whose doesn't. Meanwhile, the genre had its own running joke as well, that the black character dies first. So when you start asking who gets to be the final girl, the purity question actually gets sharper and a whole lot more political. And the corrective has been some of the most exciting horror of the last decade. Jordan Peele, basically building a final boy in Get Out, a black man as the watchful surviving center of the film. We have the Candyman reboot, directed by Nia DaCosta, dragging all of this into the light on purpose. So the trope is finally being asked to account for who it left out. So, after all of this walking, let me try to actually answer the question, is the final girl feminist or purity myth? My honest answer is she was born as a purity myth, tangled up in a male fantasy, and she has spent 50 years becoming something her creators never intended. The feminism isn't in her origin, it's in her evolution, and it's in every filmmaker, and increasingly every woman filmmaker who looked at that surviving good girl and asked, what if she got to want things? What if she got to be angry? What if she got to be the monster and the survivor? What if her survival wasn't a gold star for being closed and clean, but the simple, exhausting, heroic fact of a woman who refuses to die? That's the version I claim, not the girl who lives because she said no to everything. The girl who lives because she's paying attention, she fights back because she's been through the worst night of her life, or nights of her life, and she gets up the next morning and keeps going anyways. The purity myth was basically a cage, and the whole history of this trope is the sound of women picking the lock. So the next time you watch one of these movies and that last girl is standing in the wreckage at dawn, bloodied, breathing hard, don't ask whether she was good enough to deserve it. Ask whether she's still standing. Because that was always the one rule that mattered. Outrun, outlast, outlive. And on that note, I'm going to finish my walk. I hope you've enjoyed our little discussion here and your first Haunt Girl walk with me. More to come. Thank you for tuning in, and I can't wait to walk with you next time. Bye.